Welcome to Charge Forward Coaching, the podcast for committed athletes and individuals who want to achieve more on and off the field. Hosted by James Blasco, certified mental toughness and resilience coach. You'll gain insights and inspiration from elite athletes, coaches, and others who know what it takes to excel. Are you ready to go to the next level? Then tune in, get inspired, and let's charge forward. Now here's your host, James Blasco.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Charge Forward Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, James Blasco, and today for me, it's like Christmas Day because I have a guest that kind of a dream come true. You know, on this show, we talk about mental toughness and specifically the 4 C's of mental toughness: control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. Well, today we have the co-author of the book, Developing Mental Toughness. He's also the CEO of AQR International, one of the leading psychometric companies in the world when it centers around mental toughness, and one of the leading voices in the world on mental toughness. Doug Strycharczyk is here to tell us more about the 4 C's, what they are not, and how mental toughness plays a role just not on the field and on the court and in the boardroom and things like that, but also in our daily lives just as individuals. So Doug, welcome to the show.
Well, James, thank you very much, and especially for that welcome. This is going to be a tough gig living up to that.
I'm pretty sure you could do it. I've heard your podcast and other talks. I think you're the guy that could do this. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey into the mental toughness world and your role with AQR International?
Okay, so I mean, there is a kind of always been an interest in that because my parents were Polish immigrants into Britain after the Second World War. And my father had been captured by the Russians and taken to Siberia, eventually allowed to join the British Army in Palestine. And my mother had been captured by the Germans and taken to a forced labor camp in Austria. And of course, you know, this was their teens and 20s. And as I got to know my parents, I just saw them as people who could cope with anything in life. They never, ever were miserable about anything. There was no pessimism in the house. So it always intrigued me. And then later on, much later on, I recruited a young psychologist, that's Peter Clough, to work with me. And of course, Peter became sort of the godfather of mental toughness. He went off after having worked with me for a while, but I kept in touch with him. We were very close. And he started to research mental toughness, but from a sports perspective. He was looking at place kickers in rugby and penalty takers in soccer. And he was intrigued by the idea that both of them were pretty basic skills, but people could still screw it up, you know, and if they did, they would often screw it up again. But if they it all went well, suddenly it would go really well. So he was intrigued about this mental component, and he'd picked up on the work of the great American coach, Jim Loehr, and he began to investigate it. And in 2002, actually in around 1998, he'd worked out what it was. But because he was an academic, he had to do a lot of research to kind of be confident enough to go and put it out there. So that other academics wouldn't say, well, what a lot of nonsense or rubbish. They did when he first published it because it was so new. But he had enough evidence to be able to put his hand up and say, look, there are 4 big components to mental toughness, which we now know as the 4 C's. And because I was involved with him all the way along, and when we got to that point, Peter being an academic, he just wanted to do more research. And I thought, wow, Peter, you've discovered something really quite special here. The world needs to know about this because we think it can make a difference for a lot of people. So that's really how I got involved. And I got involved in the early development of the concept. And then Peter kind of gave me the opportunity to go and spread it to as many people as possible. And that's what's occupied me for the last 25 years. You know, it's to try and persuade everybody on the planet that this is something useful, this is something interesting, and it's something valuable. And that's really been the mission of AQR International, which I founded many years ago.
Well, you have convinced me and you have taught me a lot from a distance. And well, first of all, your personal story, that's truly amazing. And it's really profound what your parents were able to do in such challenging times, and I could see where your interests could be born with those types of parents and situations. And I had a similar situation, not anywhere near what your parents went through, but I saw my parents really work through very difficult times. They were always very positive,
Mm.
and always looking forward, so I do relate to that. And you talk about spreading the word. When I was first kind of researching mental toughness, I don't even know if I called it that. I was trying to figure out some things on my own. And then the book Developing Mental Toughness came along, and I dove in and I started to learn a little bit more about AQR, became a licensed user, and all of a sudden what became like an intangible, invisible thing started to be real and manifest itself in terms, not just for me, but for being able to help others and teach others this construct. So, what is it about mental toughness and the 4 C's that really separates itself from maybe the other research and things that have gone on for years?
Well, my background is that pretty early on, I mean, I'll give my age away. I started work in 1969 and working for a very big British company. And I began to, I had a very quickly fell into what you would now call a human resource management role. And I began to understand that what I saw around me wasn't good practice. And a lot of it, and I'm afraid a lot of it still is, was focused on behavior. And the reason why it's focused on behavior is it's very easy to see behavior. We can observe it. And, you get a lot of organizations running assessment centers. They put people in a room, make them do things, and they watch them and they can come to a conclusion about their behavior. But behavior is a funny thing because behavior is very situational. You can behave differently at home than you do at work. You can change company and behave differently in a new company. We see that all the time. And so behavior isn't that important. It is important to understand how somebody's going to behave in a particular situation. But what I found interesting is not too many people are interested to know why people behave the way they do. But there has always been that latent interest because throughout my career, people have spoken about attitude, saying so-and-so's got a great attitude, so-and-so's got a lousy attitude. How do you assess for attitude? How do we understand attitude? And really, when you look at mental toughness, we're trying to capture this notion of attitude, and attitude is kind of a catch-all term. It can mean resilience, it can mean positivity, it can mean a whole host of things. But it's really hard to assess it beforehand. You can't sit down in an interview and say, tell me about your attitude. Well, you can ask the question, but you probably wouldn't get a sensible answer. And what the psychologists tell me, because I have to own up, I'm not the psychologist in the trio. I'm very much a practitioner. My background is I'm an economist. But what I've learned is understanding where that behavior comes from is fundamentally important. And what we've now got to, it's kind of set me off on a journey I never anticipated. In 2002, I'd never dreamt that I'd be where I am now, talking to people all over the world. But we now have this really deep understanding of the mental toughness concept. As you know, we know there are 8 components to that. They call them the 8 factors. And they're all 8 independent components. And the surprising consequence of that is there are a minimum of 40,000 combinations of those 8 factors. So when we talk about where does your behavior come from, there are 40,000 possible routes to that. And, you begin to think, well, hang on, 30, 40 years ago, I was taught about Myers-Briggs and 16 types. We're way more than 16 types. If we really want to understand people, we have to understand them at a deeper level. And all the evidence now is customization is important. We see so many pieces of research that say, organizations will introduce an employee development program, but it's a one-size-fits-all program. It's come off a shelf somewhere. Everybody's going through the same program, and the program is geared to Mr. or Mrs. Average. But what we're learning through mental toughness is that Mr. and Mrs. Average is never in that training room. We are all subtly different, and we need to develop, or not necessarily to develop, to optimize who we are in terms of exactly who we are. And so we're kind of beginning to push back at a few boundaries, things like, the typing and labeling instruments that you have, the understanding of customized programs. That's why I think the group that has adopted us most earnestly and first of all are coaches. And of course, in coaching, coaches tend to work with individuals, and what they look for are concepts and instruments they can use to work with an individual. Trainers will often have 20 people in a room and they're trying to deal with 20 people. That limits very often what they can do, but we think we can actually help even there. So, that's kind of, we see the mental toughness concept digging down deeper than almost any other concept because it is fundamentally important. But it's also beginning to make us think about a lot of practices and why they haven't been as productive in the past as we'd like them to be.
Yeah, I know you were speaking the other week and you had a pie chart. I'll throw it up here when this is published, but it was the 4 C's pie chart, but then there was a couple more rings around it and the components and different things that influence someone's mental toughness in each area you just described. It just kind of blew my mind. It's like, oh my gosh, this is so big and wide and comprehensive. And you're right, it needs to be customized to each individual. Could you walk us through the 4 C's themselves for those who aren't familiar with what they are, may be tuning in for the first time? What are the 4 C's of mental toughness?
Well, the 4 C's are simply control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. That's the labels. But they're describing different aspects of the way we respond mentally to what happens to us and what happens around us. And under control, you've got 2 elements. One is life control, and that's describing your sense of self-worth. Very simply, that means if I'm asked to do something, I either think I can do it, or I think I can't do it, or I might want to think hard before I try to do it. So you can see the differences in responses that would translate into different behaviors. The second component is emotional control, and that's just really describing the extent to which we can regulate our emotions. We can't control our emotions, actually. Every time we do something, we feel it. But some of us allow those emotions to dictate what happens to us. Others regulate or take control of that response. Again, that translates into different behaviors. The second big component is commitment, and that's easily understood by most people. And that consists of 2 elements. One is goal orientation. That's really describing the extent to which we know our purpose. So when we do something, we can either know what we're supposed to be doing and how well it should be done, and that allows us to set goals, or we can't visualize like that. And so we find ourselves doing something, but really without understanding why we're doing it or why we should be doing it. So there's a spectrum. And the other component in commitment is achievement orientation. That's describing the extent to which, if asked to do something, we will move heaven and earth to make it happen. But not everybody responds that way. So again, it's kind of related to visualization. So it's the ability to imagine that I need to do this and it's really worthwhile doing it, so I'm going to go for it. Or somebody else at the other end of the scale will say, I can't get excited about this. I know I can do it, but I can't be bothered to make the effort. So, we can see already in those 4 subscales, you can have an amazing number of combinations that contribute to different behaviors. And then we move around and there's challenge, and challenge is describing a positive component of mental toughness. The first two that I've described really reflect what we would call resilience. So the ability to respond to something that hasn't gone well. But we also live and have to face the future. So when we look forward, we sometimes know that there's something ahead. We can say, well, what will I be doing in 12 months' time? Don't really know, but I know there'll be things that I can do. And I know that things will get in the way. Something will trip me up. So people who've got a high level of risk orientation will say, well, I know that there's good and bad, but actually I'm interested in the good. I'm going to not worry too much about the bad. People who've got a low level of risk orientation are more likely to take a pessimistic view and say, look, I'd rather stay as I am because I'm not sure I want to take the risk going forward. And then the sister component is learning orientation, and that's linked to risk orientation. When we do things with an element of risk, they don't always work. But those moments are our best learning moments. So risk orientation describes the extent to which we reflect on what happens to us. So we say, okay, I tried that, it didn't work. Let me think about it. People who reflect are likely to achieve more learning than people who say, that wasn't very comfortable, let's bin it, forget about it, let's move on. I mean, the interesting thing is that both approaches can be useful, but what I'm doing is describing the differences here. And then the final bit is confidence, and that's really about self-belief in your abilities. And I find this fascinating because I come across so many capable people who don't think they're capable, who think they're still missing something when they're not, and sometimes think that somebody else is more able than they are when they're not. And so this isn't about having abilities, it's about believing in your abilities. So if you believe in your abilities, you're more likely to use them. If you don't believe in your abilities, you're going to be the underperformer. And then the final one is interpersonal confidence, and that's describing the extent to which you are happy to engage with other people. And there's almost nothing we can do on this planet without at least some form of engagement with other people. I can remember talking to Jim Lower about this, and we asked him a question. We said, is there a difference between the mental toughness of individual athletes and team athletes? And he said, there's no such thing as an individual athlete. Every athlete is a team athlete. They will have a team around them. They'll have coaches and physios, and, you are always part of a team in some way. And interpersonal confidence assesses the extent to which you are happy to engage with other people. And that can be to learn from them, to share information. And the acid test for me is to ask the stupid question. That always baffles me. When you see people who will sit there and they don't understand what's going on, and they're too frightened to ask the question and say, oh, can you explain that again? You see this in the classroom in schools, you see it in the boardrooms, you see senior managers sitting there, eyes glazed over, thinking, I don't understand what's going on. And you say, put your hand up. Ask them to repeat it. No, they'll think I'm stupid. A mentally tough individual isn't bothered about that. They just want to know the answer. And, if somebody does think they're stupid, well, so what? It'll only last for a second because now I know. So those are the 8 factors, and every single one is independent. So what that simply means is if you are mentally tough in one of them, you're not necessarily mentally tough in all of them. And that is something that is also a bit of a breakthrough, because when we look at the mental toughness of people in practice, what we find is most have what we call a spiky profile. They have bits of mental toughness and bits of mental sensitivity in their profile. Very, very few are entirely mentally tough and entirely mentally sensitive. And that is the bit that I find, well, I think all of us find exciting, because when you dig down and find those areas of mental toughness and mental sensitivity, those explain why you behave the way you do. But it's been invisible up to now because it's in your head. Now, I can't see inside your head, James. You can't see inside mine. and thank God.
Lucky you. Yeah, lucky you.
Yeah. And we can't even see inside our own heads. We experience something when something happens, doesn't work. We don't necessarily understand why it didn't work. So it is really something of fundamental importance. And it's the oldest new idea that you'll ever come across, because the first person to ever mention it in writing was Plato, the Greek philosopher, who called it fortitude. And of course, that turned into Stoicism, the Stoics. And really what we're talking about is a modern version of Stoicism. Life has its ups and downs, and if we approach it in the right way mentally, we can thrive. If we don't know how we're approaching it, we're really taking a big risk.
Yeah, well, first of all, that was awesome. Hearing the 4 C's from you directly is just a blessing and a pleasure. The thing, I listened to the podcast when you had Jim on there. That was another thrill for me because I look up to him and admire his work, of course. And you bring up mental toughness and mental sensitivity. What are maybe a couple examples of each where maybe being mentally tough is not a great thing in that particular moment or situation, and maybe where being mentally sensitive is a plus or an upside?
Well, that's a really good topic to discuss, because what you've just said applies to every single one of those 8 factors. So I'm going to take one of them, the very first one, life control. Now, where the sense of self-worth sits. Having a sense of self-worth means generally if I'm asked to do something and it needs to be done in a hurry, I just think, well, leave it with me, I can do it. And you go straight in and try to do it. So in one scenario, that is one hell of an advantage. You're working with action man or action woman. However, that person may actually not know how to tackle the task they're facing. They just thought they could. So they go and try and they make a mess of it. That same behavior is now a disadvantage. So that's an example of how a mentally tough response on life control can be a disadvantage, and a more mentally sensitive response, I'll illustrate that now, can be an advantage, because the mentally sensitive response is more likely to be, you've asked me to do something, you've asked me to do it really quickly, I'm not sure, let me check, I want to think things through, I want to check with 1 or 2 people, and I might come back and say, well, okay, I'll give it a go. But I also might come back and say, sorry, I can't do it. But if I come back and say, look, I can give it a go because I've thought it through, the chances are that person has created a plan, has dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's, and is probably possibly going to do a really good job because they've approached it more carefully. However, if you really want that job done quickly, that behavior can be at a disadvantage, because by the time you've gone through that sort of process, the job's gone away, or whatever happened has already happened. The challenge there is that if you have a mentally tough individual and a mentally sensitive individual, the mentally tough individual can very often look at the mentally sensitive individual and say, what's wrong with you? I can do it, why can't you? And this is taking us into the area of team dynamics, so we can see how mental toughness is beginning to explain how people relate to each other. But the reality is both of them bring a basket of advantages and disadvantages to every task. And so we bang on a lot about self-awareness. Understand who you are, what you bring into the situation, appreciate what other people can bring to the situation. And we talk more about optimizing things rather than developing things. Optimize that situation. You don't need to develop it. Between you, you've got plenty that enables you to do a great job. Don't squabble. Don't treat each other with disdain. There is a capability there. And the curious thing about having a mental sensitive level of life control is we've been doing some research. We do constant research with our academic colleagues. And one of the things that's emerged is if you look at innovation, there is a negative correlation with life control. In other words, the more mentally sensitive people are more likely to be innovative than the more mentally tough people on life control. And yet, life control is something, the can-do approach and gung-ho approach is something that's generally valued in organizations. So you tend to see these people get into the upper reaches of an organization, but you often see the same organization struggle to be innovative because they're not necessarily the most innovative. And the reason for that is in this word, it's in this term, life control. They believe they can control enough of themselves and their circumstances to get a job done. To be innovative, you've got to let go of control. The people who are better at letting go of control are the people who are more mentally sensitive. So what we're really dealing with here, James, is a lot of complexity. This is not a black and white thing. This isn't like Dweck's growth and fixed mindset. You're either one or the other, and one's good and one's bad. It's not like that at all. What we're understanding is who we are and what we can bring to the party and what we should be careful about when we come to the party.
For everybody out there, I'm going to put in the description and show notes all of the information for Doug and AQR and mental toughness. So you could just go there. You're going to get a ton of links. So take advantage of it. In the meantime, don't forget to like and subscribe and share and all that good stuff. If you want to learn a little bit more about me and mental toughness, go to chargeforwardcoaching.com. You can even reach out. I'll give you a free discovery call, learn a little bit more about you and your goals, and you can learn about me and my coaching. But in the meantime, just keep charging forward.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Charge Forward Coaching. Remember, the journey to greatness is built on mental toughness and consistent effort. So head on over to chargeforwardcoaching.com and book a free discovery call to take the next step in your journey. Until next time, stay focused, stay determined, and keep charging forward.